What is going on, guys, and welcome back to the channel. Today we're going to be porting the turbo for the super cheap Civic build that we're working on. So right here we have a TO4E from maxpeedingrods, and it seems like a pretty good unit for the money. I'm curious to see how this thing does over time. But after looking at it, there are a few things that I think I can improve upon to help out the flow. One of them being cleaning up this compressor housing. It has a bunch of casting marks all throughout this turbo, and it necks down pretty hard right here at the outlet. So we're going to go ahead, open that up, taper it out, and clean up some of the casting marks. And then on the exhaust housing side, we've got this gasket that goes to our exhaust manifold, and it mates up almost perfectly to it. But when you hold it up to the turbo, it's got a bunch of meat left all around that flange, which is going to cause the air to hit it like a brick wall. So we're going to go in there, open that up, clean it out, and make it a nice smooth transition for the air to flow across. So let's get through the intro and jump right into today's video. So now that we've gotten through the intro, let's go ahead and get this thing pulled apart. First thing we're going to do is take the exhaust housing off, and we'll work with that, and then we'll come back later and take the compressor housing off when we're ready to work with that. So we're going to need a 13 mil wrench, and we can just go ahead and pop all these bolts free, which I already popped most of them free, except for one or two. We can go ahead and pop these bolts out in the retaining rings. I'm going to stand my turbo up like that as we pop these bolts out. Get this retaining ring out of our way. Now we've got our compressor housing and our center section. I'm going to go ahead and set these aside in a box wrapped up so we don't get any metal chips or anything in the center section itself. So now I'm going to take our gasket that we're going to use for our manifold. I'm going to hold it up like so. Get it lined up as close as you can. I'm going to flip it a couple different ways here. And just make sure that it's telling me the same spot no matter how you flip it. So no matter how you flip the gasket, it's telling us that this side needs the most off. Top and bottom aren't too bad. We'll just touch them up. And then this side a little. So we're going to take a nice fine-tipped Sharpie, and we're going to go ahead and trace that out. Now we've got a nice outline of what we need. Now I'm not saying I'm going to take all that material out back to that line, but I am going to taper it from those lines that we just made in, so when exhaust gases hit it, it's forced to go right down to the path that you want it to go down. Right now it would hit this and it would be like hitting a brick wall, and it's just not the best for flow. So let's go ahead and start cleaning this up. We're going to use a couple different tools to do this. I'm going to be using some Carbide Burrs on this die grinder here, and I'm also going to be using some barrel sanders with the die grinder when we get it closer. But this is what we're going to be starting off with. It's going to take off a good amount of material. So as you guys can see, I'm working on a nice little angle with this Burr. We're going to come in on an angle that's going to promote flow. So we're just going to keep it tapered in right where we want the flow of the gases to go. I'm going to grab a little vise and get this jigged up so it's a little bit easier to hold. So as you guys can see, I'm just slowly working that in so that it's gonna, instead of being a flat wall, it's gonna at least round and come in. We will take a little bit more material off in a little bit further here, but right now I'm just starting to get the shape that I want made. Always make sure, whether it's on a TO4E from max beading rods like ours or some other turbo, to make sure that you don't go too far. You do want a good amount of material here to keep this housing nice and strong. We're just gonna keep slowly working this, and when I get it far enough, we'll switch over to a different tool. As you guys can see, we're getting this thing roughed in pretty good. Touch up the corners a little bit more. I'm going to take a decent amount of meat out of the corners real quick. Touch up a little bit right in the middle of that one. And then we're going to move on to something a little more delicate than this Burr. Alright guys, so as you can see, when we hold that up now, that looks like a much smoother transition. We didn't take a crazy amount of meat out of there, but just the fact that it's not hitting a flat ledge, it's going to roll on the exhaust housing here and want to flow that way. So we're going to go ahead and grab something that's a little bit more delicate than this Burr, and we'll get this cleaned up a little bit better. Now I'm going to step up to a barrel sander on our Dremel. I'm going to use 80 grit to start, and we'll see how this goes and work from there. Alright guys, I'm pretty happy with that. I think it looks good. It's pretty smooth. I ended up going with 80 grit. I'm not going to go crazy and polish it, but just the fact that we have that a nice, smooth, and clean transition now is going to be a huge improvement over what that was. That looks night and day better. So now we've got to clean this thing up, but before we do that, let's go ahead and start working on the compressor housing side, and then we'll just clean these both up together at the end. The compressor housing comes off basically the same way. We've got 6 bolts here that we've got to pop out real quick. Set the bolts and locking rings off to the side. And then just carefully pull up on our center section. And now we've got our center section fully isolated from the compressor and the exhaust housing. I'm going to go put this in a bag again to keep it nice and clean, and then we can start working with this. We've got our compressor housing jigged up here. Now this part, you can go as crazy as you want. You can get as nice of a finish as you want to dedicate time to this thing. We're going to go in and mainly worry about all the casting marks. I'm not sure if you guys can see it, but there's a seam from casting all the way throughout this compressor housing. So we're going to start off with a mini Dremel and a very small sanding barrel drum, and we're going to just go through and try to knock that down, get it a little bit smoother. Now you want to be careful because there are some machined areas in here, like we don't want to mess with this at all. We just want to go with the volute inside there and knock down some of the rough casting marks. So I found a barrel sander that's going to fit in there. On different size turbos you can use different size tools. In our case, it's a very small turbo, so I'm kind of limited to using something like this. So we're going to start at the toughest spots, which is up in here where it's the tightest and smallest area to clean. And then we're going to work our way out to a spot where we can start using bigger and better tools for the job. So let's go ahead and get set up here, and we're just going to slowly start knocking down all those casting marks and smoothing it out the best we can. I decided to grab some painter's tape, and I'm just going to go around this thing and put some on all of the machined surfaces. I did end up nicking one over there. Not bad, but just enough for me to be like, you know what, I don't feel like fixing a bunch of these little nicks, so I'm just going to go through, put a little bit of tape. It'll help protect it. It won't save you if you're just straight on whaling it with the Dremel, but it will help just from like a occasional bump or something like that. So just gonna tape those up. I might put a little bit around this lip too real quick, just so we don't have to go through with 1000 grit sandpaper or 2000 grit sandpaper after and fix a bunch of nicks. All right, that's a little bit better, and now we have at least a little bit of safety here. So if I do jump, or if the Dremel jumps a little bit, we don't have to worry as much. So let's get back to work on porting this thing. So as you guys just seen, we took our time, went through here. It's been taking quite a while. It's a very tedious process. You've just got to take your time and keep working through it. But we've got this thing looking a lot better than it did. Let me take it out of the vise and show you guys real quick. I know it's kind of hard to see on camera, but if you can see in there, we have gotten this thing a lot smoother. We just used an 80 grit barrel sander for now, and we've gotten everywhere that we can with that. We're gonna step it up. I haven't worked on the outlet yet. You guys might get a better look at that. That's what the whole thing looked like. It had those big casting marks and the big divots just from casting in general. So we just went through there, cleaned this thing all up. It's looking much better. There are some spots that we can't quite get to, but this thing does not have to be perfect. Anything's better than how it was. So like I said, you guys can take as much time as you want getting this thing as close to perfect as you possibly can. But for what we're doing, I'm kind of just gonna rough it out, and then we're gonna hit it with a little bit finer paper to clean it up and call it good. We are gonna do some work to the outlet, but I'm saving that for last. So let's get a 320 grit barrel sander set up, and we'll go through and start cleaning this thing up. So we've got this thing about as good as I care to get it for now. The inside's actually looking pretty good. It sucks your finger doesn't fit in there so you can feel like how smooth it became and everything. But it's actually looking really good. I know it's hard for you guys to see in there, but we'll go ahead and get set up and start porting the outlet, and that way you guys can see exactly how much better it looks from where it starts right here. So as you guys can see, the outlet is extremely rough, and it has those big casting marks in it, top and bottom. So we're going to take those out, open this thing right up, and smoothen it out. So on the outlet here, I'm going to work it a little bit differently. I am going to take the casting marks out and smoothen this all out, but I'm also going to work on trying to taper it a little bit. Not sure if it really makes a huge difference in flow, but I'm going to try to taper it from here out to here being the widest point. So let's go ahead, grab our Dremel, we'll start cleaning it up. I might also move to our die grinder at some point, and I've got a bunch of these little flap wheels. They're little sanding flap wheels. We're going to start with this small one, and then as we go bigger, we'll start stepping up to these. So let's go ahead and start cleaning this thing up. Alright, so as you guys were seeing, that was working, but really slowly. So we're going to step it up to this Burr on my die grinder to get a majority of the material out and get it to start taking shape. And then we'll step over to the flap wheel on the die grinder. Once we get the majority of the material out, then we can step to something a little bit more delicate like that Dremel. So that's obviously working much better, and we can take quite a bit of material out at a time. You just want to be careful and make sure that we leave ourselves enough material for this to be structurally strong, but also enough material that we can come in here and fine tune this and clean it all up when we're done with the Burr. So let's keep on working it with this thing, and then we'll step down to something a little bit more delicate. Alright guys, so as you can see, we've taken a lot of material off. I could keep going more. This isn't quite too thin yet, but I do use some pretty strong T-bolt clamps, so I don't want to make it too thin and then potentially crack this cheap cast aluminum. So we're going to leave about that much meat on it, and now we're going to switch over to some sanding wheels and start cleaning this thing up and get it nice and smooth. So that came out pretty good. I was using a 40 grit flap wheel and it was working perfectly. Took a bunch of material off but left a half decent finish. Now I could run it just like that. This thing doesn't have to be perfect, but I am going to step it down a little bit finer. I think I'm going to go to a 120 and then I might go all the way down to 320. But again, like I said before, guys, you can spend as much time doing this as you want. If you want to get that thing perfectly mirror polished, you can just keep stepping down grits until you get to a polishing wheel. But for what we're doing, we don't need a polish finish all throughout here. So we're just going to get it to a point where it's nice and smooth. So let's step down to a finer grit and get this thing cleaned up. So we've got the exhaust and compressor housing ported out to a point where I'm happy with it. They actually came out really good, especially the exhaust housing for this gasket. This thing fits so much better. I think the air is going to flow over that transition 10 times better than it was going to with it hitting a brick wall. You can see how much material we took out. There's a ton on the floor, but that's just what landed on the bench. So now that we got these things ported, it's important that we clean them extremely well. So I'm going to take them out to our parts washer. We're getting ready to change the fluid in that thing anyways. So I'm going to run these through the parts washer quick. Then we'll use some brake clean and a little brush. And I'm going to just make sure that we get everything out that we possibly can. Then we can get ready to put this thing back together. So let's go clean these things up. So now that we've gotten everything all cleaned up, I just wanted to give you guys a closer look at both housings here. Now, I know it's hard for you guys to see. You probably can't see in there at the inside of the compressor housing, but it is so much better than it was. The casting marks were bigger than this by a lot and all over the inside of there, as well as some defects from the way they cast them, I guess. So it was pretty rough inside there, but we got it to be a lot nicer and a lot smoother. The outlet here, I ended up taking some 2000 grit sandpaper to, and I'm really happy with how it came out. It's super smooth. It's not a mirror finish, but for what we're doing, it's way better, and it's just way bigger in general. So super happy with how that came out. And then on the exhaust housing, we didn't do much with this one. The only thing I wanted to do was make it so that the gasket was going to fit better, and it definitely does. I think it looks a lot better, and I think it's going to definitely help flow a lot, because you no longer have a brick wall for the air to hit. It is a pretty big transition right there, but it's definitely smoother than just hitting a flat surface. So I think that's going to help channel all the exhaust gases right through the exhaust housing a lot better than it was going to from the factory. So now that we've got everything all cleaned up here and laid out, let's start putting this thing back together. So we'll grab our center section and set it in place, just like so. And we will take our retaining rings, grab a couple bolts, now I'm not going to tighten these down yet. I'm just going to get them all started. Set this down for a second. As you're going together, always make sure that your impeller spins perfectly fine. You don't want any binding or anything crazy going on there. And keep in mind which way we need to be able to clock this for when it's installed on the car. In our case, it needs to sit something like that. Now we can move this over, grab our compressor housing, and carefully set this down on it like so. Again, just make sure everything rotates freely like it should. Everything's seated properly. Now we can grab our locking rings for the compressor housing and our bolts. And then once we clock this thing on the car, we can go ahead and tighten these down with a wrench. And it's really as easy as that, guys. This thing's all back together. So it's really not that big a deal. It's super easy to do, and I am very happy with how it all turned out. I think for the project that we're going to be using this on, it came out perfectly, so I'm super happy with it. So it's really that easy to port one of these turbos. I'm super happy with how ours came out. And it's not that difficult. It just takes some time and a little bit of patience. But if you guys have the patience, you can do this too. If you're curious to see how this turbo works out for us, make sure to subscribe, because in the next video, we will be installing this turbo on the super cheap Civic build. So as always, I appreciate you guys for checking out the channel. Don't forget to like, comment, subscribe, and ring that bell. And check us out on all of our other social media platforms. We've got Facebook, TikTok, and Bought to Build Official on Instagram. And we will catch you on the next one.